Hello, I'm Marianne Broom. Welcome to Nature's Edge Studio. Today we're going to be painting some gorgeous pink tulips in watercolor. So I hope you enjoy the demonstration, and I invite you to visit my website at mariannebroom.com. So happy painting! So here you see my reference photos and my color chart. This is my main reference photo, and I have my paper more of a square shape. It is 20 by 15 inches more or less. These two photos are for the leaves, but these tulips here are actually these ones. This is a different variety, but this is a good picture for leaves. So this is my color chart. The supply list and the reference photos are available for you to download. I was wondering about my background, looked at my color wheel here. We are mostly in the permanent rose area with our colors. So if you go across the color wheel to the complementary color, you see that it's Viridian. So I decided to use some Viridian in my background, but I'll also use a more yellow-green, and then of course I'll mix greens for my leaves from the blue and the yellow. And these are my brushes. I use mostly filbert brushes for my floral paintings. I also have masking fluid and a pickup eraser to take off the masking fluid when I finished. This is my kneaded eraser, and I have used an HB pencil to sketch out my flowers. And for applying the masking fluid, I use one of these color shapers. So now it's time to start our painting, and I'm going to start with the back flowers. I'm going to show you two different techniques. On the back flowers, I wet the whole flower and paint it all at once, but on the main flower here, I paint one petal at a time because I want more definition in the main flower. So I'm going to wet the whole of this flower just with clean water, making sure that I go carefully around this main flower. And I'm going to wet this one at the same time. You can do them separately if you prefer, but I'm going to go fairly quickly with these, and since I have the same colors, or I need the same colors, I might as well do them together. I want to make sure that I have my water right up to the edges and that it's all nice and wet. And now I'll start with my colors. I've got them ready on my palette here, and I always start with my lightest color. So that's going to be the bright rose. So I'm just going to lay that in where the lighter colors are. And some of this, there will be some overlap with the darker colors. So it's not too critical where I put this. So I'm just starting with this bright rose, and then I will be adding more colors to this. And I'm not too concerned that the petals are running together. They're bound to do that with this technique. But as it dries, I will gradually get a little more control of the paint, and I'll be able to reinforce some of the edges. Okay, so the color on some of these is slightly more in the like cadmium red. So I'm going to add a touch of red in there. It's a good idea to get as many colors as you can into a flower, or within reason, of course, but just look really carefully at your reference photo to see what colors are actually there, because you do want the variety of color as well as variety of value, of course. And this is still really wet. Now my pencil lines are still showing. I would not normally have drawn them quite as dark as that. I suggest you put lighter pencil lines in. I did it like that so that you could see what I have drawn. Now here we have some darker areas. So I'm going to mix my bright rose with some of the permanent rose. And also use some of that color here to suggest some more shape. So I'm not being as picky with these back flowers as I will be with the main flower. The idea is to get these in quickly before the paint dries. So I'm still looking for slightly darker areas. This is not my darkest color. I'm working from light to dark. It's the opposite of acrylics, where you work from dark to light. I'm still looking for any variation in color and value. The more I can put in, the better. I'm actually going to lift a little bit out here. I'll clean my brush and then use the damp brush to lift out a little color where it's a little lighter at the edge. Okay, back to my darker color for this section here. And I'm going back to my bright rose for this section of this petal. This is much lighter. I'm going to have a clean, damp brush ready for lifting. I'm going to lift out some light here. So in the areas where there's more light, I can do a little lifting. And I want to do that before it dries too much. But now I need to go to my even darker color. So I'm going to add some of my Thio Indigo Violet to my permanent rose. And I have to make sure that my paint is not too runny. You want to be careful to avoid blossoms, and the way to do that is to make sure that you're not applying paint that is more runny than the paint you already have in that area. So anywhere I see some darks, I'm adding this darker color now. Just lifting a little bit again. And there is a little bit of purple on this vein in this petal. And I'd better move over to this flower before it dries too much. So you can see that I'm just using quick strokes to drop in the color. The water and the paint are doing the work. I don't need to keep brushing an area. I'm just laying in the paint and then leaving it to do its own thing, which of course is the beauty of watercolors. I can lift out at the edges here to define the edge of the petal a little more. And I'm still looking for the colors that I need. This needs a little bit more of this cadmium red in here. A little more of the pink in here. If I have too much paint on my brush, I just wipe it off on my rag. And when you're lifting out, be very careful not to use a wet brush, because at this stage that would just create blossoms. I have to be careful here because this has already dried, so I'm going to use more concentrated paint to make sure that it doesn't run and create a blossom. Now, if the paint dries too fast, you can always let it dry, come back and re-wet it. if you're afraid of adding paint that's too watery. But I'd like to try and get this finished. And the paper has dried for the most part, so the paint is no longer running as much as it was before. I'm still getting a little bit of softness, but I have to be really careful not to add more water. And if I want to soften an edge, I just go in with a damp brush and run it along the edge. Just using a clean, damp brush to lift out the edge of this petal again. So having finished the back flowers, I'm now going to move on to my main flower. And I'm going to be doing that one petal at a time. And it doesn't matter which order you do it in, as long as you're careful not to paint a petal next to a wet one. So I think I'll start with this petal here. And I'm going to wet the whole petal. This is supposed to be clean water. It's a little pink from the paint still on my brush, but it's not a problem because the whole petal is pink anyway. I'll start with my lightest color, which is my bright rose, and apply that color everywhere that I see it on that petal. And some of this will get covered up with the darker colors. So now I'm going to the next color, which is my permanent rose. And I want this flower to be brighter and warmer than the back flowers, because this is my main flower. And you see that I'm using a big brush. This is a 1-inch brush, and using a big brush stops me getting fiddly. You just want to lay in the color, let the paint and the water do the work. You don't want to be brush, brush, brush. So I'm mixing my Bio Indigo Violet with the permanent rose to get a darker color. It's pretty dark here. It has a fold in the petal. It's also a bit darker here, and quite dark in this little pocket here. And just for a little bit of color variety, I'm adding a little bit of cadmium red. I do see some more reddish color in this flower. But the back petals should not be as warm as the petals at the front. That will give a sense of perspective if the back petals are slightly cooler in color. So I'm just adding some straight purple here. Just making sure that I have intense enough color, because I have to remember that watercolors dry lighter. I've been painting mostly in acrylics, so I'm used to them drying darker. But you have to be careful not to just put too much straight purple. You can see how dull that purple color gets. So for this main flower, I want to try and keep it a little more bright. I'm not going. Okay, I'm moving on to another petal. I don't want to do any that are touching this, so I'll move over here. This petal looks like two separate ones, but it is in fact all one petal that has got a dip in it. So I'm going to adapt that a little bit. I'm not going to have it have that highlight exactly where it shows on the reference photo, because I think it would look rather awkward if you painted it exactly the way it looks. So I've wet the whole petal, and once again my lightest color, the bright rose, first. Then I'm going to go to my permanent rose. And also I'm going to mix that with a little violet, because this petal is quite mauve in here. And I'm going back to my permanent rose. Just needs a bit more color intensity there. Now I just have to decide whether I want to lift anything out, and I think I will. On this edge here I have some masking there, so around the masking needs to be a bit lighter so that I don't have a hard edge on the light. Okay, so I can move on. I can't do this petal. This is the only one I can do. So I'm going to do the underneath part of this petal. I'll have to do this in 2 sections. So once again, I'm going to wet the whole thing, the whole section. And put in my lightest color first, the bright rose. Even though this is underneath, it has got, I think the light is shining through the petal. So my strokes are always in the direction that the petal is formed. In this case, it's going this way. So I need something with a little purple. I don't want to go entirely purple, so I'm mixing the purple with the permanent rose. I think that's more or less all that petal needs. There's not a lot happening on that little part. Now I need to choose a spot that is not next to a wet part. I think this is probably dry, so I can come in and paint this petal. This is all part of the same petal, even though it has some splits in it. So I'm going to wet this whole thing. Okay, so in with my lightest color again, the bright rose. And I have to be careful on this petal to go very light where there are some lighter areas. So now on to my permanent rose. And this petal does a little flip. It's folded over here. Okay, I need to soften this edge. Just a damp brush to soften it. And now I'm going in to more of a purple color. Mix some purple into the mix. And there are some actual lines here, but I don't want to get too many stripes in, so I'm being careful not to put too many lines. Just enough to show the direction of the petal. And the same happens on this one. it's looking too stripy, so I'm going to soften that. Come back with just the tip of my brush and not quite as much paint, just to show the suggestion of those sort of stripy lines here. And there is some sort of more crimson color in here, where the light is shining through the flower. Okay, so I need to move on to another petal. I think this one is dry, so I could paint this section here. So I'm going to wet this whole petal, or this inside section of the petal. This underneath part I will do separately to get more definition. And once again, it's quite light in certain areas of this petal. So starting with my bright rose, it's very light in here, so I want to save the light there. Now moving on to my permanent rose. And I'm going to use a mix of permanent rose and bright rose just to get some color, some more color on here. And this is masking fluid on here. Now there is a little flip here, so it seems to be more crimson in this part, with a little bit of the mauve. And I think that's all I need to do on that petal. So I'm looking for where I can go next. I could do this one next. There's a little fold in the petal here. So there's a highlight where it kind of curls around and then flips up again. So I'm going to wet this whole petal again. I have to go around the stigma in the middle. Doesn't matter if I go over the darker stamens, but this area is very light, so I have to avoid that with the pink. So start again with bright rose. There is a little bit of warmer color here and there, so let me add some cadmium red to my mix. And then I need to go back to Permanent Rose. And I have to try and leave some light around this vein. And I need to lift out this light section. So again, it's a clean, damp brush, and I lift and then I wipe it on my cloth. So I'm going to go to my purple now, mixed with my crimson. And a lot of this petal is in shadow here. I'm using less water in my paint here because I want to get this line in, and then it sort of fades away. So I'm going back to my bright rose because this section of the petal is still quite pink. Permanent rose again. That was too dark, so I'm going to lift some of it out. I need a bit more of a purpley color. And I need to make sure my brush strokes indicate the direction of this flipped up piece of petal. This is a very soft transition. Just soften that. I have a spot of masking fluid where I don't want it right there. So I'm going to remove it and then try and soften this area. I got rid of the speck of masking fluid. And there are some little lines here, but once again, I don't want them to be too definite, just enough to suggest the movement of the petal. Okay, I have some clean water now, so I'm going to wet this whole petal. I have to be careful right here because I just painted that petal. So making sure that I just leave the tiniest gap and don't overlap it with this water. So bright rose again. Oops, let's wipe that off. Fortunately I have masking fluid there. Okay, before I go any further, I want to add a little of the red color. And because this is one of the front petals, I can paint it even a little warmer than it actually is. I'm mixing that red with my permanent rose. So now I'm going to my permanent rose. And I'm mixing that with a little of the violet now. And I have to be careful how I handle this because of this vein here. This is quite a unique shape, this petal. And before I put in the vein, this does need a little more color. This needs to be a little deeper in here. soften that. Just a damp brush. Okay, I think I can go back now and put in that vein. So I'm mixing my purple with the permanent rose again. I have to be careful where I rest my hand here. I want to put in this vein. But it's still wet, so it's still running a little bit, which is good because it's quite soft, that line. So that has already dried, so I need to soften. The paint didn't run, so therefore I need to soften it. And I think that's good for that petal. Now I can do this section in here. It's almost white, there's very little color to it, so just use a tiny bit of my bright rose. And then there is a little purple coming down through here. And this little piece is in shadow, so it's darker. I have this section here to do. So let's wet that section. Bright rose first. And then to my permanent rose. And a little bit of purple with that just under here. Okay, maybe I can do this little piece here. I'm going to use my round brush because I want to be very careful not to touch the area that I've already just painted. Okay, so now we can move on to this center. I have masked out there are 4 or 5, I'm not sure which, I think 4 little sections to this. And they're like little sort of indented cups. But the darker color is slightly greenish. So I'll get some of my ultramarine blue, mix it with yellow, and just paint in this section here. Needs to be darker right here. And then it turns into more of a yellow color. Still a tiny bit green, so I'll drag the green color through. And then I need some color at the center of these little shapes. Now that I look at it carefully, it looks slightly orange, so I'm going to add a little bit of, tiny bit of red to my yellow here. just under here looks a little bit orange. I'm going to make this even darker so that it contrasts with the petal here. This is my center of focus, so this needs to have the greatest detail and the greatest contrast. So I'm putting a little more contrast than it actually has, just to make it pop a little bit. And then there are the two stamens, which are actually a browny color. So I'm going to mix a purple, though I already have a purple, of course, but I'm going to mix my purple with the red and with a bit of blue. I'm trying to get a browny color without actually going to a brown. So we need a bit of yellow in there. Okay, that's good. So I'll start with a slightly thinner mix because some of this is pretty light. Okay, now I can go to a darker color. And I did put another stamen over here. It's not actually in the reference photo, but I thought it would balance it a little better. So I need darker color. So I'm adding more purple to my mix. So now I'm ready to start painting my leaves, and rather than mess up my palette here where I've got my pinks mixed, I'm going to use the lid of my Stay Wet palette, and I have put out some oriole and yellow, ultramarine blue, cadmium red, and a little purple. I do like to add a little flower color to my leaves just to harmonize the painting. And I used, for these leaves here, I believe I used this one and this one back here. It's very rare that the photograph itself has a suitable composition. This is very awkward here, for instance, and these leaves are very clumped together. So usually I just either design my own or pick some leaves from another photograph. So I'm going to mix up a green with the blue and the yellow. And I want a little variety in my greens, so some will be more yellow and some will be more blue. So I made two mixes here. This one's more yellow, this one's more blue. So I'll start with my lightest color, and with a leaf I usually just apply the lightest color all over. There is no white on this leaf, so I don't need to reserve any white, so it's easier to just paint the whole leaf green to start with. So I'm going to paint these two together here. Just saves a little time. But I'm not doing the underside where it has curled over, because I need a good transition. So that's my light green all over the leaf. Now I'll go into my blue-green. And I don't take too much time on my leaves because they're there just to support the flowers. So this leaf that I'm painting is quite dark in here, and it has more of a bluish tinge to it. Before this one dries, I should get some color into that. This has a shadow. This is this leaf. It has a shadow in here and down here. But I don't want these leaves to be too yellow, so just adding a slight wash of a more greenish color. Sorry, a more bluish color. And these tulips have parallel veins, so if the leaf is curvy, the vein is going to follow the curve of the leaf. In this case, it will disappear under this fold. So I'm just going to keep putting in a few more veins just while we're still wet in wet, because I don't want them to be too harsh. And I'm going to change my color a little bit. I'm going to add a little red. Mix it here. And you can see that dulls down the green quite considerably. That's because red is the complementary color. And to dull a color, you add the complement. So I'm just looking for some variety of color on these leaves. And now I'm going to go to a little bit of purple. It's not, I don't actually see it here on my leaves, but I'm adding it to add interest and to incorporate some of my flower color. It also is useful for the shadow areas. And it's good to have the leaf dark where it's in shadow from the flower. I'm just looking to see if there are any highlights, and there is a highlight on this leaf here, so I'm going to just tease out a little bit of color, and the same here on the leaf. And I can also lift out a little more to suggest veins. This leaf needs a few more veins here. So this purple has dried rather dull here, so I'm going to switch to my crimson. I think that might give me a better color on the leaves. So I'm going to lift that a little bit and place in a little crimson instead. I'm going to add a little bit of crimson just elsewhere on my leaves. This is artistic license, of course. Now, I have added paint that's too watery here, and I'm getting a blossom. So the way to fix that, I can fix it quickly before it dries, is to lift out some of that wet paint and then put back the darker color that I had on there before. Just add some pink, but this time I'm going to be careful that it's not too watery. I'm just adding pink here and there, and you can see how that creates harmony with the flower. So the leaves are finished, and now I'm going to start my background. So I have my big 2-inch wash brush, and I'm going to start in this corner, wetting the whole area with clean water. And I have to keep the leading edge wet so that I don't get any hard lines. So I'm just wetting over here as well. It doesn't matter if I don't get totally close up to my flower, because I can solve that as I add in the color. Going to use a smaller brush just to get into these little corners here. And this needs to be pretty wet because we're going to do this background wet in wet. We want it to flow, the color to flow in the wet paint. And I have lots of pieces of paper towel ready here to mop up my edges. And also, if I go over the petal by mistake, I need to wipe the water off. As I have done here. And I want to get into this little space here. And then just bring the water down here to keep it wet. Now I did a little sample of the colors, and I think this kind of viridian green would be perfect for the top of the painting with some yellow. And as I move down, I want to get darker, but I can't use a dark green because of the leaves, so I'm going to switch to more of a purpley color and mix that with some pink, and I hope that'll work well. So I've mixed up some viridian color here. I just used my ultramarine blue and yellow, and I did actually add in a touch of viridian, but if you don't have that color, you can just use the ultramarine blue and yellow. I'm just dropping in this color here. And if I go over the petal just a little bit, I'm not too concerned because I do want the edges to be softer at the back. I have to keep this leading edge going here. Just going to wet beyond here so that I don't get a hard line. But I'm going to start with this area. So I'm just dropping in the color. Need to make sure that this is wet down here. And I want to add some yellow just to brighten this up here. I'm just dropping it in, and then I will tip my paper to let it flow a little more. So now I tip my paper and let the color run. And you can see how it's all kind of flowing together. The water's running down the edge of where the masking tape is. I have to keep drying that, or else the water will run back into the painting and create a blossom. And if you have a ridge, you need to make sure that you tip the paper and let the paint flow, because you don't want the you don't want the paint to dry in the ridge. But while this is still a little damp, I just wanted to show you how I handle any really hard edges. There are some edges here that are too hard. The background flowers need to have softer edges than the main flower. So if the edge is too hard, I just tease it with a damp brush to soften the hard edge, and it takes some of the paint into the background. I'll do the same over here. That has softened that edge, and some of the blue has gone over this, so I'll just tease at it and it will soften the edge at the same time. And same with this flower. And it doesn't have to be perfect. If it's not perfect, it will be obvious that it's a painting and not a photograph. Not that this looks like a photograph, I hope. I'm just touching up this edge a little bit. And the edges on this flower can, for the most part, stay harder. Maybe at the back I wouldn't mind softening a couple of edges here, because the front petals should have harder edges than the back ones. Okay, so I'm going to stop there and let the background dry. So my background is dry, so I'm going to use my pickup eraser. This is a very old one. It looks pretty crummy, but it still works. If you don't have one of these, you can just use your finger to remove the masking, and you have to make sure that your fingers are clean. You don't want to smudge dirty paint on. But I'll use my pickup eraser, and I'm just lifting off all of the areas that have masking fluid. Now that I have all of my masking fluid removed, it's time to soften some of the hard areas. I need to add some color to the edges of these leaves. I do not want them to be pure white. So I'm going to mix up just a little very light green here and just tint these edges to subdue that white. If you end up with a little jaggedy edge like this, that can be corrected with the darker color. But it doesn't have to be perfect. And this color can just kind of be slapped on, because if it ends up overlapping the leaf color, it's not going to show because it's so light. Down here it needs to be a little darker where it's more in shadow. And I'm going back to a lighter color. That's too yellow. I don't want it to be so bright because these are the leaves. They're not my main focus in the painting. And then I may have to just touch up a couple of areas here where the line has got too fat. Okay, so now I need to look at the flower. The first thing I'm going to do is paint in the stigma. And we've done most of it, but I just need to refine the shape. This is quite yellow, and it would be good if we made it a bright yellow so that it stands out, because this is our center of focus. But I want to leave a light edge, not totally white. I'm just using a very pale yellow on these lighter areas. and it needs just a little bit more green in here. I need some contrast. Okay, I will come back to that. I need to soften these edges. I'm using my scrubber brush, and wherever I have an edge that is too hard, I'm going to just tease on the paint side of that edge, just to soften it. So I don't have a hard white line. So I need to keep dipping this in clean water to keep it clean. Now you can see how that is softening these areas of masking. And if I don't want it quite as white, then I tease some of the color into the white area. This highlight here needs to be softened. I don't want it to be obvious that I have used masking fluid. So this is the back flower, so I'm also softening the hard edge that the masking left against the background. So I'm going to go around the whole painting and soften the edges like that. So I've softened my edges, removed all the masking fluid, softened the edges, and now I just have a little touch-up to do. I need to repaint these stamens. And I'm going to start with a lighter color. There are two of them on this side. And then go back to my darker color here. And that allows a little highlight on the stamen. Just looking at the reference photo. And then there's another one on this side, which is not showing up very well because I don't have a good highlight on it. So I'm going to see if I can lift out a bit of a highlight. I just have a damp brush, but just tease and blot. And that has given me a little bit of highlight on that stamen. Let's do the same with this one. Okay, now I have a lot of light in the center of this flower, and it is actually white in the photograph, but I think I'd like to add a touch of yellow to it. So I'm going to just wet this area and bring the water up a little bit into the petal. And I can do the same over here. And the same, I guess, on this back flower, although I don't want this to be too bright yellow. So I just mix up some yellow that is not too dark, just fairly diluted yellow, and I'm going to drop it in here. And you can see that does just add a glow to this center of this flower. And I can tease the yellow up a little bit onto the petal. I'm going to put a little yellow here. It's a bit too dark, so I'll water it down. I don't want it too bright here. It's really important not to have it too bright in that spot. But I could add a little bit more intense color in here. And I think that has added something to that flower. Just that hint of yellow. So there we have it. I think this painting is finished. I've softened all the edges, left the highlights. Just one thing I need to do is put a little yellow in here. Although this back flower should not be too bright. Just a hint of yellow. So, there we have it. That is the painting finished.